I have put this presentation of our family history together for several reasons. One is to put at least some of the stuff I've learned in one place so others can listen and watch this either now or one day later when I'm no longer here. Another reason is to whet the appetites of those really not interested in this kind of stuff now who may consider doing their own digging one day. Also, and more importantly, learning a bit about who you are and why you are the way you are can come from the lives of those ancestors who have passed before us. As I approached retirement, I looked more and more at our family's past. When I started this project, I had to decide how far back I wanted to look to begin this presentation to keep the casual listener interested. So I will start with the 30 most important family members who came before me. By the way, most of what I discuss here can be found on Ancestry.com. You can search for the Goddard family tree under Bruce Goddard. It is a public tree and available to whoever is on Ancestry. My genealogy travels have taken me to all kinds of places. I spent almost a whole day in Athol, Massachusetts, visiting the graves of my ancestors and talking to historians there. That led me to the old burying ground on Harvard Square at Harvard University, where I found the grave of Benjamin Goddard, my first ancestor born in America. I spent the day in Camden, Arkansas, and found graves and houses built by our Goddard family there. And I've been to Fort Myers, Florida, several times to check out my mother's side of the family at Fort Myers Cemetery. We even had dinner at the Veranda, originally the Gonzalez home place my mother's grandfather built. My brothers and I walked in the woods to find the Mones Cemetery in Juniper, where we would find the graves of the Mones and McCoys, our paternal grandmother's family. The directions to see that old cemetery are also on Ancestry in our tree. We have also made an untold number of trips to Magnolia Ridge at Rose Hill Cemetery in Macon and stood at the graves of 3 generations of Goddards. As I see it, every person on earth has 30 crucial people who came before them. People who had a lot to do with who you are. Every person has 16 great-great-grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 4 grandparents, and 2 parents, for a total of 30. You never know many of them, but whether you knew them or not, they contributed significantly to your DNA and ultimately to who you are. In many cases, they come from different places. Ours certainly do. In our case, 8 great-great-grandparents came from the Goddard side of our tree, and 8 from the Gonzalez tree. Let me introduce the Goddards first in the order they were born. From Athol, Massachusetts, James Goddard. From Hartford, Connecticut, Sophronia Marshall. From Milford, Connecticut, Treat Hines. From Eatonton, Georgia, John Maund. From Richmond, Virginia, Charlotte Settles. From Eatonton, Georgia, Lydia Phillips. From Eatonton, Georgia, Augustus McCoy Sr. From Eatonton, Georgia, Lucy Clark. Now the Gonzalez family. From Tennessee, Robert Calvin Armstrong. From Polonia, Asturias, Spain, Manuel A. Gonzalez. From Minden, Germany, Augustus G. Frederica. From Hopetown, Bahamas, Elavina Weatherford. From Columbus, Indiana, Mary Bramble. From Abbeville, South Carolina, Sarah Young. From South Carolina, John Haskew. From Madison, Florida, Carolyn Langford. We only have 8 great-grandparents, again introduced in the order they were born. From Macon, Georgia, Edward Goddard. From Macon, Georgia, Julia Hines. From Tobbleton, Georgia, Sarah Virginia Sally Maughan. From Taubleton, Georgia, A.C. McCoy Jr. From Key West, Florida, Manuel S. Gonzalez. From Columbus, Indiana, Robert Bruce Armstrong. From Meridian, Mississippi, Maria Frederici. From Madison, Florida, Irene Haskew. We will talk about all 8 of these folks in this presentation, and you'll see photos of each. But we only have 4 grandparents. Ours are George Henry Goddard, Lucy McCoy, Clyde Gonzalez, and Mabel Armstrong. None of us knew Clyde, but we knew the other 3. We'll talk about all 4 of them. So how did we end up in Reynolds, Georgia? You will find that story interesting. To be honest, it is a miracle story. Let's begin by talking about James Goddard from Athol. In 1825, he married Sophronia Marshall from Hartford, Connecticut, which was about 70 miles from Athol. James had a slightly older brother, Bailey, who had already moved to Georgia when James was married. The cotton industry was booming in Macon, Georgia, and there were opportunities in agriculture, trade, and business. The government was also offering cheap or free land in Georgia after the Creek and Cherokee lands were ceded to the United States. The lure of the potential to make big money would have been attractive to 2 young men with adventurous spirits. I believe James had already been to Georgia before returning north to get married. Bailey Goddard was a sole proprietor on Mulberry Street in Macon in 1827. Sadly, Bailey died in 1831 at only 33 years old. I first saw James Goddard in business in the Macon newspaper in 1828. The company was called Goddard Langford. I did notice an article much later about James's son George Goddard in St. Louis. That article mentioned that his father had moved to Macon in 1821. I cannot find proof of that in newspapers, but he certainly could have. James worked in Macon while his wife, Sophronia, stayed in Hartford with her family. I read in the newspapers that James went up north every now and then for long periods. The first 3 of their 9 children were born in Hartford. The first child died at age 1. I suppose James went back to Hartford when that happened. Traveling in those days took work, by the way. James could have taken a stagecoach, but probably a steamboat to Savannah, where he would get on another steamboat or sailing ship up the eastern seaboard. If he did that, he would take a steamboat river route to Hartford. That trip would take a minimum of 3 to 4 weeks. The stagecoach ride would take about the same amount of time, but it would be more grueling. James and Sophronia's second child, Horace, was born in Hartford. He would later drown in Macon at the Ocmulgee River when he was 11 years old. The third child, George Henry, was born in Hartford and would become the most successful of the James Goddard children. The first child born in Macon was James T. Goddard. He would eventually have a drinking problem and died soon after the Civil War in Arkansas. Sophronia moved to Macon between 1831 and 1835, when they would have 6 more children. Sophronia was busy having babies, while James was busy making money, and lots of it. James and Sophronia had 6 more children in Macon between 1835 and 1842. 4 of their 9 children died as children. Thank God for the last son born. His name was Edward. If not for him, we would certainly not be here. James did very well in Macon, especially during the early days before the advent of the railroad. He was in the steamboat business, shipping cotton down the Ocmulgee River from Macon to Darien. From there, it went to Savannah and up the eastern seaboard. He owned several steamboats and warehouses where he stored cotton. He got a percentage of the sales. James was also active in one of the early leaders of the First Presbyterian Church of Macon. James built at least 2 houses in Macon, which displayed his success. One of the houses still stands. Since this photo was taken, this house has been restored and is located on Georgia Avenue in Macon. I have read that it was built in 1836. The Goddard family lived in this house for only a short time, and the details are fuzzy, but it is known in Macon as the Goddard Scott Huff Johnston House, and it was built by James Goddard. I know James Goddard built a house on top of the hill on Spring Street, and he and his family were living there when he died. There are several articles in the newspaper where he leased some land for 99 years for $1 that was contiguous to his property and joined Rose Hill Cemetery. The city approved that because James had spent his own money improving it. Interestingly, his friend and neighbor, Treat Hines, took over that lease after James' death. We'll talk about Treat later. This is known as the James Goddard House. I assume this was an earlier version of the house we saw on Georgia Avenue, but the more I look at it, this could be the house on the hill on Spring Street. This is the site of the James Goddard House on the hill on Spring Street. The building you see was built later, but James owned that entire block at his death. While I'm at it, I will show you the Treat Hines house on Walnut Street, which stood diagonally across the street from the Goddard house. This house is no longer there. Treat Hines would play a massive role in our existence. James's steamboat business was disrupted by the advent of the railroad in the early 1840s, and he would have to find another way to make a living. My gut tells me he went through a difficult financial time, especially when compared to his prior income stream. Because of his reputation in town and business acumen, he founded an insurance company and served as its president, but he continued looking for more ways to make the money he was accustomed to. He was on a business trip in the North when the unthinkable happened. He suddenly died in Greenfield, Massachusetts on October the 19th, 1846. He was less than 30 miles from his hometown of Athol when he died. He left a wife and 5 young children. It would be the next spring before the body arrived in Macon for a proper funeral and burial. A large crowd attended his funeral. The city of Macon erected a monument in his memory on the Goddard lot at Rose Hill Cemetery. The monument still stands. This photo shows the Goddard lot on Magnolia Ridge in Rose Hill Cemetery in Macon. Let's talk about Sophronia, the wife he left behind. Her story is an important part of the Goddard story and how he ended up in Reynolds. While James was doing well, Sophronia, as a young mother, had a difficult time. For starters, as I have mentioned, of her 9 children, 4 of them died as children. Among them was their oldest son, Horace, who drowned in the Ocmulgee River at 11. I assume he was hanging around the wharf, helping his daddy. If that was not enough, Sophronia's mistress, Sally Goddard, was accused of attempting to poison her. Yes, they had slaves. But this mistress would have been the slave to whom she was very close. There was a trial, and there were witnesses. But in those days, looking back, you cannot know about the integrity of the justice system as it concerned a slave. Sally was sentenced to death by hanging for the attempted murder and was publicly hanged in the jail yard at the foot of Cherry Street across from the cemetery. I visited that spot a few years ago just to imagine that scene. That hanging happened in 1837. With the hanging of her close friend and slave mistress, Sally, the deaths of 4 of her children, and now being left alone with 5 children to raise, may have just pushed Sophronia over the edge. The family stayed together in Macon for a while, but after 3 long years, now 7-year-old Edward was sent to live with Sophronia's mother in Perryville, Ohio. George, the oldest living child, left for Charleston, South Carolina, where he worked for the well-known and successful Bancroft family. In 1850, he moved to New York City, where he found more success. Then in 1858, George moved to Camden, Arkansas, where he settled and found even more success. In the meantime, young Edward's grandmother died when he was 10, and he had to finish his education in East Hampton, Massachusetts, where he lived with more relatives. After he graduated, he headed to Arkansas to join his big brother and his other siblings. George's success in Arkansas paved his way for all his siblings to join him in Camden. He was apparently a father figure to his younger siblings. They did not know that a war between the states would be brewing soon. Their mother, Sophronia, did not join them in Arkansas. She spent many years in Brattleboro, Vermont, in a mental hospital. She had been declared insane. During my working days, I had a funeral home in Brattleboro and visited there several times, but I did not know about Sophronia's story at that time. Years later, after the war, when Edward returned to Georgia and had success, he moved his mother from Vermont to the state hospital in Milledgeville. He visited her often, and she died there in 1885. All the siblings traveled to Reynolds to attend the funeral in Macon. She was buried beside her husband James in Rose Hill Cemetery. Speaking of Edward caring for his mother, his journey after he left Macon as a young kid is incredible. At age 4, his father died. At age 7, his mother was declared insane. At age 7, he moved to Ohio to live with his grandmother, who he could not have known. At age 10, his grandmother died. At age 10, he was sent to live with other relatives in Massachusetts. At age 17, he moved from Massachusetts to Arkansas to join his family, who I am sure he did not know. At age 19, Edward entered Company H of the 6th Arkansas Infantry Regiment and began fighting against his family and friends in the North, where he had spent most of his life. Then, after fighting this terrible war in terrible conditions, somehow Edward found himself back in Macon, Georgia, of all places, when Macon surrendered to the Union troops. He was exhausted, he was sick, and he was alone. He had to be hospitalized. When he was discharged from the hospital, he had 50 cents to his name. Edward took his 50 cents and began to trade. He bought cakes and made corned beer to sell. He set up shop in a closet of the old Floyd building in downtown Macon. Then an incredible thing happened, or better said, providential. His dad's old friend, Treat Hines, discovered Edward was at the Floyd building. The next thing you know, Edward and Treat's son, Richard, had formed a business partnership. This is just a reminder of the scene in Macon 20 years earlier. Treat Hines and James Goddard had been friends and neighbors. Treat had done well in Macon, too, as a builder. He helped his son and his friend's son expand their business outside of Macon, where there was opportunity. In 1866, Richard and Edward moved to Butler in Taylor County and started a business called Hines and Goddard. Very soon, Edward bought Richard out and moved to Reynolds and started in business as E.A. Goddard. Another thing happened in all this. Edward had fallen in love with Treat Hines' daughter, Julia. They were married on December 28th, 1870 in Macon. This story keeps getting better. For the next 53 years, until Julia's death, Edward and Julia made a wonderful life in Reynolds, Georgia. In 1872, Julia's father, Treat Hines, the builder, built a new house for his daughter and son-in-law in Reynolds. The house still stands today. This house faces Highway 128 or Winston Street at the corner of East Haines Street in Reynolds. As of 2024, it is 152 years old. Treat knew what he was doing in building a house. Edward and Julia had 4 children and raised them all in that house: Ida, Lottie, George, and Eddie. The third child, George Henry, would become our grandfather. Edward died in 1925 at 83. Julia died a couple of years earlier in 1923. They both died in the house Treat Hines built for them. We need to move over to Tarleton, Georgia, and see what was happening there. A.G. McCoy married Sally Maughan in Tarleton in 1882. They had 2 children, Lydia and Lucy. Probably only 2 children because Sally died at 35 years of age. Lucy would most likely hardly ever remember her mother. A.C. McCoy was a successful merchant in Tarleton. Lucy was very close to her dad and looked after him. You can see pictures here of both her parents. Toward the end of his life, A.C. McCoy lived with Lucy and George in Reynolds, and he died in Reynolds. This picture is of the 2 McCoy siblings. My older siblings called our grandmother Lucy. My brother George and I called her Amma because we could not pronounce grandma. We called her sister Auntie. They were quite a pair, had plenty of stories, and loved to laugh, and smoked cigarettes. Auntie was a chain smoker. She lit her cigarettes off the last one she smoked. It did not shorten her life much, though. She lived to be 86. George Goddard from Reynolds and Lucy McCoy from Tarleton married on February the 7th, 1906. I do not know how they met and fell in love. I do know they got busy quickly. Their first son, George, was born about 10 months after their wedding. Their only daughter, Lydia, was born in 1910, and the youngest, Ed, was born in 1918. This is a picture of George and Lucy's children taken at Daddy's Emory University graduation. George went on to have a stellar career with General Electric, where he was part of senior management in marketing. He and his wife, Carol Smith, were living in Baltimore when he was diagnosed with Parkinson's. He retired at age 54, and they moved back to Reynolds, where they built a house just down the street from his brother. Daddy visited him often and sat with him every Sunday afternoon. They were extremely close. He lived for about 7 years after moving back home, and was homebound most of that time. He died in 1968 at the age of 61. Lydia, Daddy's sister, and her husband John Mangum lived in the country on what is now Mangum Road. Lydia was a fun-loving lady who loved to laugh. John had a long career with Flint EMC and retired as head of purchasing. He was also a primitive Baptist preacher, and a popular one at that. He also loved to laugh. Our daddy was very close to his siblings. His brother George had 2 daughters, Carolyn Goddard Major, who lived most of her life in Rome, Georgia, and Ann Goddard Charles, who lived in Lebanon, Pennsylvania. The top picture on the left was when I was in Lebanon on business. I had dinner with my cousin Ann and 2 of her grown children. We did that a couple of times. John and Carolyn are on the bottom left, and Carolyn and Ann with a couple of grandchildren are in the other picture. Our other first cousin on the Goddard side is Lydia's daughter, Lucy John Mangum Smith. She is pictured here with her 6 children. All of George and Lucy's children were raised in this house in Reynolds, which was built in 1908. George built a miniature replica of this house to scale before his house was constructed. That replica was upstairs in the old store for many years. I don't know where it is today. Our good friends James and Cheryl Cameron live in that house today and have restored it to a showplace. Big Daddy and Lucy would be proud. The same year George built the house, Big Daddy, as we called him, also made this train set out of Arm & Hammer baking soda boxes. He built it with a pocket knife. The detail is impressive. He was quite a craftsman. This train sits on the top of our bookshelf in the den of our home today. This is a picture of George Goddard, Big Daddy, and his dad, Edward Goddard, taken in the early 1920s in Goddard's store. The Goddard family operated on this site for 111 years and were in business in Reynolds for 131 years. George Goddard took over this business from his father sometime before this photo was taken. Somehow he survived the Great Depression. Not many did. He did go broke, but Freeman Hard, a friend in Macon, loaned him money to help him stay open. George was able to pay him back every dime he owed him. Many young folks who did extraordinary things in life worked for Edward and George Goddard and other Goddards to come later in this store. To start with 50 cents selling corned beer in Macon to this business in Reynolds, Georgia, is quite a story. But George Goddard, or Big Daddy, was quite a character. In 1997, I received a letter from a man who grew up in Reynolds, moved to Virginia, and did very well in life. He worked for our grandfather as a kid. He describes what that was like. Dear Bruce, my sister Hilda Weaver James, whom I call Hidjibo, forwarded me the Macon Telegraph article of April 19th, citing, among other things, your association with Goddard Funeral Home. From this somewhat remote vantage, I wish I could do justice to your enviable heritage. Since such is unlikely, a few reflections may be of interest. Your great-grandfather, E.A. Goddard, whose name's emblazoned that store after it was rebuilt, next to Coop Payne's livery stable, from whom I bought my first pig named Porky, had the reputation of being quite a staunch personage. He battled one of the local citizens with a pistol. The challenger was armed with a knife. Such was life in Reynolds. Back in the 1930s, when I began work for Goddard Grocery Store and Funeral Home, customers tethered their mules, no one had horses, on the side of the store across from Dole Sanders' blacksmith shop. I recall vividly watching this smithy work. The local fire bell was in his yard. Few people, very few, had autos or trucks. Exceptions were the bootleggers from Crawford County, the local doctor, and the rural mail carriers. Goddard's did have a hearse. When used as an ambulance, a sign showing ambulance was substituted for hearse. We were a cotton, corn, peanuts community with a few peach orchards up the road toward Butler. We were just emerging from the Great Depression when my father supported himself, his mother, my mother, and 4 children by earning $5 per week running the fertilizer plant for C.H. Neisler. Although we would soon enter another mini-depression occurring about 1937 to 1939, coming out of it with the onset of World War II, my father was able to apprentice me to your grandfather, George H. Goddard, to learn the funeral business and pursue this as a career. Originally, I was and continued to work on Saturdays at 50 cents per day. Simultaneously, I clerked in the store and delivered groceries to the local townspeople. I still have a healthy respect for yard dogs, many of whom chased me relentlessly. Incidentally, there is no item known to man heavier than a 5-gallon can of kerosene, which I, as a 90-pound weakling, delivered. I would fill the household's kerosene heater. My hours were from daybreak to closing time, about 10 p.m., when I swept the store clean using an oily red sawdust. Mr. George was the greatest of teachers and also a hard taskmaster. My sole foundation in the morals and ethics of business is attributable to Mr. George. To this day, he means so much to me. He was a completely fair man. His accounting methods, cost identification, and code were unequaled. Helping out during my tenure were Hanson, the porter, who could do anything, including embalming, the most capable and reliable of any of us, with Miss Virginia Hammock, later brewer. We each had a separate drawer in the cash register. Mr. George taught me to meet customers at the front door. No other merchant did this. From there, I chaperoned each and provisioned the need. The customers were not allowed to select merchandise. We cut the fat back or stricoline, the cheese, round, the meats, and selected the fish. The mullet fish bought locally were wrapped by us in old newspapers, and we knew who got the white lily flour and who got the off-brands. Along about 5 p.m. on a hot day, the mullet fish developed a distinct aroma that became more pungent as time passed, like more slimy, but our clientele loved them as well as the salt mackerel. For lunch, I usually had a pint of milk and 2 penny wheels, huge vanilla wafers, with a slab of cheese between the wheels. This cost me 10 cents, which after all was 20% of my gross. When Social Security came along, Mr. George quite magnanimously informed me that although he was supposed to deduct 1 cent per week or month from my pay, nevertheless he was going to pay my portion plus his portion, total 2 cents. If you put this in perspective, remember we were in a depression, his gesture was somewhat formidable and appreciated. The funeral home and embalming room, you could view this when standing next to the nail kegs, were across the rear of the store, and although we were the only game in town, my training suffered from lack of decedents. Our only competition was in Butler, who occasionally would encroach into Potterville or Crowell, but never Reynolds. By the same token, we left them alone also. I was called from school to run the store in Mr. George or Miss Virginia's absence. Hanson always went with Mr. George, so I began functioning almost entirely as a clerk. Meanwhile, I served as Mr. George's collection agent. We had several delinquent accounts that I pursued relentlessly. The amounts were formidable for the time, mostly from under $1 to $5. But remember, we were in a depression. On slow days, I spied on the competition. They could all spot me, mainly Altman's store and Sheely's store, and would report back to Mr. George. After working for 2 to 3 years, Mr. George gave me a 10-cent per day raise to 60 cents per day. To this day, I have never received a percentile increase to equal this. I also began working at the store during my school lunch breaks while Mr. George went home. He couldn't afford other help then. 2, Mr. George had an ongoing arrangement with the Montezuma Picture Show operator in recompense for him advertising the current picture show. Along about this time, Mr. George arranged for me to deliver weekly circulars promoting the current feature in Montezuma to each home in Reynolds. I did it via bicycle. For this, I also received a free pass, valued 10 cents, to the picture show. The fact that I had no transportation for the 22 miles was inconsequential. I could, and did, ride with Mr. George and Miss Lucy. Mr. George and Miss Lucy looked alike. You favor Miss Lucy, so did your dad, which is a compliment indeed. Hanson looked after your great-uncle Eddie, who lived with Miss Lottie. Eddie didn't like baths, which Hanson gave him daily, and you could hear him yelling all over town. I knew your father well, and to some lesser extent, your Uncle George. The last time I saw Ed, he invited me over for some scuppernons and boiled peanuts. Your father was a great athlete and played first base on the Reynolds high school team. He was the strongest man I ever knew. Although I nursed a latent resentment toward him, knowing that one day he would return to Reynolds and take my place, I admired his capabilities and respected him greatly. We worked together and hunted together. Once we flushed some partridges in a wooded area, and I shudder in recalling that event even today. In swinging around the fire, I missed your father's arm by an eyelash. He likely had powder burns. He was my dear friend. Mr. George was a fly fisherman, and I used to row him in his canoe. We all suspected that your dad would marry one of the local belles, so I was quite astonished when he returned, and I was called to help him wrap meticulously a gift for his girlfriend in Florida, your mother. Space, and indeed your patience, must limit my other reflections, although these are myriad. 2 items, though. I saved enough money, $32.50, by working for Mr. George to buy my first car. Maurice Altman, the local bank clerk, knew this amount represented several years of toil and pleaded with me not to throw it away on an A-model Ford. Secondly, after several years with Mr. George, and he was again on his financial feet, I believe Ed was there, and I wasn't too critical to his operation, Mr. Rob Altman offered me 75 cents per day. With proper apologies and notification, I moved over to the competition, mainly because not only was the pay greater, but snacks were gratis, a hidden 10 cents to 15 cents raise. Such is the value of fringe benefits. The Goddards and Reynolds are almost synonymous. Our families have been close. Your grandfather and my mother grew up together, and it's so rewarding to see you carrying the torch. Your grandfather and father were the greatest of men. I am so fortunate that each played so great a part in establishing my moral and economic foundation. Sincerely, Booty, April 25th, 1997. P.S. No need to acknowledge. Tell Hijibo hello. So going back, the same year Edward Goddard established a business in Taylor County, Georgia, something significant was happening in South Florida. Manuel Antonio Gonzalez, a boat captain, immigrated to Cuba from Spain. He eventually ended up in Key West, Florida, where he became a U.S. citizen in 1859. On February the 5th, 1861, 28-year-old Manuel married Evelina Weatherford, a 24-year-old Bahamian girl. Manuel was not only a boat captain, but he was a serious explorer. He was always looking for a place to settle down. A few years after he was married, he noticed an old abandoned fort on the west coast of Florida. In 1866, he took his 3-year-old son, Manuel S., his brother-in-law, John Weatherford, and a friend, Joseph Vivas, to that abandoned fort to investigate. They knew this would be the perfect place to make a life. Manuel and the small group with him became the first settlers of Fort Myers, Florida. And there they are, Manuel Antonio Gonzalez and Evelina Jane Weatherford, our great-great-grandparents. Manuel and Evelina had 7 children together. The oldest, Manuel Sisquamon Gonzalez, will become our great-grandfather and our mother's grandfather. And there were Mary, Bernie, Odulia, Joseph, William, and Alfonso. Here's a picture of most of Manuel and Evelina's children. I think the only one missing in this picture is Joseph. About 20 years after arriving in Fort Myers, the oldest son, Manuel Siskelman, married Irene Haskew of Madison, Florida. Manuel and Irene had 6 children: Fred, Clyde, Thomas, Selma, Charles, and Leslie. Clyde would become very important to the Goddard story. Interestingly, Fred and Clyde married sisters. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Manuel, our mother's grandfather, found success in business in Fort Myers as a builder. Our mother remembered her Gonzalez grandparents and spoke about them from time to time. She was 16 when her grandmother died and 18 when her grandfather died. Among the houses he built was the Gonzalez home, which eventually became a well-known dining establishment called The Veranda in Fort Myers. The Veranda still stands today. Here's the photo of the Veranda in Fort Myers. I've been able to eat there on several occasions. Meanwhile, close to the time when Fort Myers was settled, a man named Robert Bruce Armstrong was born in Columbus, Indiana. In 1889, Robert married Maria Louise Frederici of Meridian, Mississippi. Maria's father was Augustus Gustavus Frederici, a German immigrant who came to America from Midland, Germany. Robert Bruce and Maria would eventually become our mother's maternal grandparents. So here's Robert Bruce and Maria Armstrong, my mother's grandparents, and where I got my name. Robert Bruce and Maria had 6 children: Augustus, Mary Ellen, Robert F., Reamer, Mabel, and Robert Bruce Jr. We have great memories of a few of our grandmother's siblings: Aunt Ellen, who lived with her poodles in Fort Myers; Aunt Reamer, who lived with her husband, who raised quail in Jacksonville; and Uncle Bruce. I flew with Mama Mabel to Arcadia, Florida for her brother Bruce's funeral in 1978. Mama had recently had surgery, so I took her place. That was quite a trip that ended with a couple of nights in Fort Myers. But back to the story. I do not know how Mabel Armstrong from Arcadia and Clyde Gonzalez of Fort Myers met and fell in love, but I am certainly glad they did. They married on December 25th, 1918. Since Clyde's life was cut short, Clyde and Mabel only had 2 children, Naia and Betty. Naia and Betty were not only sisters, but best friends. Betty and her family visited us often in Reynolds, and we always visited Aunt Betty and her family in Maitland, Florida, on the way to our regular visits to Fort Myers. Aunt Betty had 2 children. The oldest, Marcia, is deceased. The top picture on the right is Marcia as a baby with George and me in 1958. Marcia would be 66 if she was still alive today. Jamie, pictured on the left, is with the Goddard siblings on a family weekend at the lake several years ago. Jamie is our only first cousin living on the Gonzalez side of the family. As I mentioned earlier, Mabel Armstrong and her older sister Ellen married the Gonzalez brothers. Left to right is Fred Gonzalez, Ellen Armstrong Gonzalez, Clyde Gonzalez, and Mabel Armstrong Gonzalez. That means their children were double first cousins. Mama and Mary Allen Gonzalez were like sisters and always very close. Ed and Stanley were like 2 peas in a pod and became like brothers. They had a good time together, and their children have wonderful memories of that taking place. Left to right in this picture is Mary Ellen Gonzalez Hanson, Stanley Hanson, Naia Gonzalez Goddard, Mabel Armstrong Gonzalez, Ed Goddard, and Ed's first cousin, Anita Marshall. But back to our grandfather, Clyde Gonzalez. As a young man, he quickly made a name for himself in Fort Myers as a shrewd businessman. He was the assistant cashier at the First National Bank until he resigned for an opportunity in Colorado. After his return to Fort Myers from Colorado, he was very active in the city. He looked after the financial affairs of the estate of Senator Stadler. Clyde was president of the Sunglazers Club, and he led the effort to build the Fort Myers Pier. He became a principal in the Fort Myers Realty Company. A group of citizens pushed for him to run for mayor. It was stated he was the front runner. Then his brother, Tom, announced he would run against him. Clyde, who never announced he was running for mayor, withdrew his name as a potential candidate. Here are a couple of pictures of Clyde. Notice the number of years between his birth and his death are relatively short. It happened on Friday evening, November 7th, 1930. Mabel had gone to a bridge party and left the girls, ages 13 and 6, home with their daddy, Clyde. Mama told us this story many times. Her daddy had complained about having indigestion earlier that day. That night, the three of them, Clyde, Naia, and Betty, were sitting on the porch when Clyde told Naia he did not feel well and was going to bed. Naia was worried about her daddy and asked him if there was anything she could do. He told her he would be fine. When her mama got home, Naia told her that her daddy was sick. Mabel went to check on him and could not awaken him. She heard him gasp. She sent Naia to get Dr. Crutcher, who lived next door. Mama remembers running and screaming. Dr. Longbrake and Dr. Stone were also summoned to the house. But it was too late. The three doctors agreed that Clyde Gonzalez had died of acute indigestion, which would be called a heart attack today. He was 38. This photo is of Clyde and his two daughters, Betty and Naia. As for his young wife, Mabel, she never remarried. She spent many years working at the tax commissioner's office in Fort Myers until she retired. She raised her two daughters alone. She lived in a little house on Stella Street, and we all have fond memories of spending the night there on our way to Fort Myers Beach. She would join us at the beach. In 1970, at 75, Mabel moved to Georgia and lived 19 years until her death in a mobile home in the backyard of her daughter's home in Reynolds. She never owned a television before she moved to Reynolds, and we insisted on her getting one. She said she did not need one because she was an avid radio listener, and that was enough. But soon she began watching soap operas and other shows on TV. Lawrence Welk was her favorite. She would run over you to get back to her home to watch those shows. She died in the Oaks Nursing Home in Marshallville, Georgia on July the 4th, 1989. She was born on Christmas Day, married on Christmas Day, and died on July the 4th. Mama Mabel was quite a lady. But back to her oldest daughter, Naia. She spent the rest of her teenage years without her daddy and with a strict mama. She entered and won a few beauty pageants along the way and was a young socialite in Fort Myers. You can see that in the newspapers. She was in charge of several clubs and was in the newspaper often. She grew up quickly and was working at the Fort Myers News Press when her life began to change. She was just minding her own business. And here she is at 23, working as a classified ad clerk for the newspaper. In fact, she had become the face of the classified ad division of the Fort Myers News Press. Almost daily, there was an ad with Naia's picture in the paper. The deal was, if you had a phone number in the local phone book, you could take out an ad over the phone. If you did not have your name and phone number in the phone book, you had to come in to take out your ad. You can read that in the ad you see here. Meanwhile, a dashing young man named Ed Goddard, who had a psychology degree and had recently moved to Fort Myers to take a position with Franklin Hardware Company, kept seeing that beautiful woman in the ad in the paper. He couldn't shake off the image of this mysterious woman he saw regularly in the paper. He did what most other warm-blooded young men would do in this situation. He went to the newspaper office to take out an ad. He met young Naia. When she asked him what he wanted on the classified ad, he stated, "Ed Goddard is asking for a date with Naia Gonzalez." I don't know if that classified ad ever made it to the newspaper, but incredibly, she accepted his invitation for a date against her strict mother's advice. But some things did make the paper. A few months later, their engagement was announced in that same newspaper. And a few weeks after that, on April the 7th, 1941, Ed Goddard and Naia Gonzalez were married. Ed and Naia moved to Reynolds to begin their life together and work in the family business. 10 months later, on February the 15th, 1942, their first child, Edward McCoy Goddard Jr., was born in Butler, Georgia. He would be known as Mac. World War II began a little over a year after that, and Ed left in April 1943 for officers' training school at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, as part of the U.S. Navy. Naia and little Mac visited him there, but Naia lived between Fort Myers and Reynolds during the war. Ed did get to come home a few times during the war, enough times to get his wife pregnant again. Naia Elizabeth Goddard, known as Kiki, was born in Fort Myers on February the 1st, 1945. It would be a few months before her daddy would see her. Ed Goddard took this photo in June 1945 in Atlanta. He was on leave, and this was the first time he saw his daughter. Kiki was about 4 months old. They all returned to Reynolds for several days before he headed back to sea and the end of the war. After the war, Ed and Naia settled in Reynolds and lived there for the rest of their lives, which would be close to 50 years. After living in the apartment at Big Daddy and Lucy's house and later in a rental house down the street, Ed built this house around 1950. A jack of all trades, Ed personally did the electrical wiring and the plumbing in their new home. Ed and Naia raised all 4 of their children in this house. The doors were always open for their friends and their children's friends. A heap of living took place in this home. Speaking of their children, there were 4 of us: Edward McCoy, Naia Elizabeth, George Clyde, and Robert Bruce. Based on the information you have received here, it is easy to understand where we got our names. All of our grandparents are represented in our names. According to my math, we are about 81% American, with a small mix of Spaniards, Germans, and Bahamians. But we are 100% Ed and Naia Goddard, and we are most proud of that. Who were they? Here are a few words to describe them: servant leaders, people of integrity, outgoing personalities, fun-loving, plain-spoken, entrepreneurs, risk-takers, caring, love to laugh, and most importantly, spiritual giants. And I am sure my siblings could come up with many more words. The postscript. Mac married Annis Brunson in 1964, and as of 2024, they've been married for 60 years. A graduate of the University of Minnesota, Mac spent some of his career in the funeral business and as a merchant, but he has spent the majority of his life as a minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Mac and Annis have 2 children and 3 grandchildren. Kiki graduated from Wesleyan College and spent her career as a teacher and guidance counselor in the public school system. Kiki had to bury 3 husbands in her life. They all had one thing in common. They had one wonderful wife. Kiki has 3 children, 9 grandchildren, and 6 step-grandchildren. I won't try to count the number of step-grandchildren, but there are many. 3 great men, 1 extraordinary wife. George married J. Mitchell in 1991, and they've been married for 33 years. George is a graduate of the University of Georgia and the University of Georgia School of Pharmacy. He worked part of his career as a pharmacist and part as a drug representative for a major pharmaceutical company. George and Jay have 1 son and 2 grandchildren. I married Kathy Underwood in 1977 and way outkicked my coverage. We've been married for 47 years. I'm a graduate of the University of Georgia and spent about half of my career working for myself in the funeral business and the other half working for SCI, the world's largest funeral and cemetery company. We have 3 sons and 9 grandchildren. Who are we? We are very blessed and very grateful people.